It is March 7th. Welcome into a brand new Sunday edition of the Pack a Day podcast here on YouTube. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL and the podcast at Pack a Day Podcast. We are inching closer and closer and closer to the madness that will be free agency. We are getting closer to a ton of cuts. I expect there to be more trades. And today, I want to focus on one of those trades that I think potentially could make sense for the Green Bay Packers. And that trade is for Patriots cornerback Stephon Gilmore. And for those who may not be aware, it is expected at this point around league circles that Stephon Gilmore will in fact be traded this offseason. If you look at New England right now, they are not expected to compete at a high level this upcoming season. They have questions at quarterback as well as throughout their roster. Stephon Gilmore is on the last year of his deal, which I'll get to more in just a moment. Basically, New England is looking for younger assets at this point, and having a player like Gilmore on the roster doesn't make a ton of sense because, again, they're not expected to compete at a high-end level this upcoming year. So Jason La Canfora actually just recently wrote an article, and he basically said that the trade seems like an eventuality, that it is going to happen, and he did actually mention Green Bay as a potential suitor in that article, which makes sense because of what Green Bay's weakness potentially is at that cornerback position, but outside of Jair Alexander, of course. So I think the big question here is, what would Stephon Gilmore net in a trade for the Patriots, or in this case, what would it cost Green Bay to get a player like Stephon Gilmore? There was one article that I saw that was suggesting that the Patriots were looking for a first-round pick and a player in return. And I can tell you right now, one, that I would be shocked if New England gets anything close to that for a 30-plus-year-old player on a one-year contract. I just don't think they're going to get anything close to a first-round pick plus a player in return for Stephon Gilmore. Secondly, that if it was the case that they're getting a first-round pick and a player in return for Stephon Gilmore, it goes without saying that is a complete and utter non-starter for the Green Bay Packers. And this is Brian Gutekunst coming from a Ted Thompson tree that values the hell out of top 100 picks, maybe more so than they should. But there's no way should they give up a first round pick plus a player for Stephon Gilmore at this point. So if it gets to that point, that's a non-starter. But Jason La Canfora in his article mentioned that a more likely deal would be, potentially like a 2021 third round pick and a 2022 fourth round pick. So something more to that extent. And I think even that is probably a bit exorbitant for Stephon Gilmore if you're giving up a third and a fourth for Gilmore. And I think that would still be a tough buy for Green Bay and a tough sell for Brian Gutekunst, again, who hates giving up those type of draft picks. But I think you're getting closer at that point to potentially being able to make that deal. And especially if maybe instead of a third and a fourth, maybe you could do like a third and a Josh Jackson, right? And maybe you could even do a 2020 third round pick instead of a 2021 third round pick and Josh Jackson. Maybe even you do something where you tie it to the Packers' success, where, it's a 2021 third rounder that you're trading, but if Green Bay wins the Super Bowl, it moves to a second round pick or something like that, which at that point, who the hell cares if you give up a second if you just won a Super Bowl, right? So there could be a few different things. And again, I think Josh Jackson's very much in line for a change of scenery anyway. So maybe you can do a conditional pick where the Patriots get Josh Jackson. If he ends up hurt or not playing, the Patriots get a fourth. If he plays, but not, Green Bay doesn't get to a Super Bowl or whatever, they get a third. And if Green Bay gets to or wins a Super Bowl, the Patriots get a second. Something to that extent I could see making some sense, and Green Bay at least being interested in that conversation. And I think the other thing that you have to realize here as you start looking at compensation is that Green Bay has 10 picks to make in 2021. They can't keep 10 rookies on this roster. They just can't, nor should they when you're trying to compete for a Super Bowl this upcoming season. That's too many rookies to keep. So Green Bay is going to have to be active, whether it's trading up in the draft using those picks or trading for veteran players in some capacity, giving up a third round pick potentially for a Stephon Gilmore, which is, near the end of the third round, which they haven't exactly had a ton of success on lately. Players like Montravius Adams and Jay Sternberger. We'll see what happens with Josiah DeGuara. Those type of players, if you're looking at trading a player like that alongside of a Josh Jackson for a Stephon Gilmore, even if it's for a one-year rental, it starts becoming much more palatable. The other thing I would say is even if Green Bay would trade away their third round pick this year, for Stephon Gilmore, which is, again, tough. It's a tough pill to swallow, giving up a top 100 pick, but you still have your first and second round pick. And I guarantee you that using their fourth round pick and other picks that they have in the draft, that they have enough ammunition to get up at the beginning of the fourth round where they would still have a third round player on their board available, I guarantee you. So they would still have the potential to leave the draft with 3 players that they would deem on the top 100 of their draft board. So I don't think that even giving up a third round pick this season, again, maybe along with like a Josh Jackson, would limit them in any capacity from being able to get out of the draft with a really good haul that they would want three of their top 100 players, plus, again, a player like Stephon Gilmore to help you here and now. So let's jump into next, why make this deal for Stephon Gilmore? So first and foremost, Stephon Gilmore is a 4-time Pro Bowler. He's a 2-time All-Pro. And let's not forget, he was just the Defensive Player in the Year in 2019. This is not like he was in his prime in 2016 and he's fallen off since. This was literally 2 years ago. He was deemed the best defensive player in all of football in 2019. 2020 was a strange year with the pandemic, especially with the New England Patriots. So yes, he was coming off a little bit of a down year and came off an injury as well. It was down for his standards. But oh, by the way, in that down year, he still only gave up 27 catches on 42 targets for 354 yards, 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. Nothing egregious in any way, shape, or form. And you have to remember how the New England Patriots utilized Stephon Gilmore. They put him on an island a ton. So even in those situations where, he is getting targeted, he's consistently on an island all by himself. So you're not seeing in those numbers the value that you have in Stephon Gilmore, being able to leave him one-on-one in a variety of situations, especially a lot of times against teams' number one corner. So, our number one receiver, excuse me. So there is a lot of value still in Stephon Gilmore, and there's no question that he is still one of the top cover players, or has at least the potential to be one of the top cover players still in the NFL today. And I think what I love about this deal for Green Bay is that in Green Bay, he doesn't have to be the guy. You have Jair Alexander on the other side, arguably the top corner in football. You don't have this 30-year-old corner having to go one-on-one against the Julio Joneses and the Justin Jeffersons and whoever you want to put in that category of top wide receivers in the conference right now. You don't have to match him up one-on-one against that player game in and game out, play in and play out, right? You can simply match him up, Allen Robinson within the division. You can match him up on the opposite side of Jair Alexander, keep those guys on their sides if you want to, and you potentially have 2 of the best corners in the league on both sides of the field shutting down the opposing team's wide receivers. It immediately becomes one of the biggest strengths of any team in the NFL, having both Jair and Stephon Gilmore in the same secondary. So I love it that he doesn't have to be the guy in Green Bay. Another reason this makes sense, you may be thinking, well, Andy, Green Bay doesn't have a ton of salary cap space. So how are they going to make Stephon Gilmore move work? Not only giving up a top 100 pick, maybe a player, but they just don't have the cap. Well, this is the beauty of why this trade makes sense. He's only set to make $7.3 million this season once he's traded for. $7.3 million. In comparison, Tyrell Williams, who I just talked about yesterday for the Detroit Lions, wide receiver, coming off a season when he was out for the year, a middling mediocre wide receiver, just went for over $6 million on a 1-year deal. You're getting the 2019 Defensive Player of the Year for 1 year, $7.3 million. That is an absolute steal. If you were on the free agent market, I think you can make a strong argument that he gets a very similar deal to what J.J. Watt just got. And you have to pay him for a longer term. You're getting more dead cap eventually. With Gilmore, you are getting a 1 year, 7.3 deal for one of the best corners in football to pair with Jair Alexander. There are very few moves that Green Bay can make, either in free agency or a trade, that they can go sort of all in now with the salary cap space that they have without mortgaging the future and still getting a high-end player like a Stephon Gilmore. This to me makes a ton of sense for Green Bay. So again, it's one of the very few all-in sort of guys that they can actually afford to bring in. So yes, you have to give up a pick, but that's the price that you pay for bringing in this type of player. So it pairs with Jair Alexander really well. It solidifies one of your biggest weaknesses. It brings in a premium player at a low price. And even if Chandon Sullivan is still your slot guy, like you can put extra emphasis. You have a secondary now where you've got Gilmore and Alexander on the outsides with Amos and Savage in the backfield. You're still, it sounds like they're keeping Preston Smith, right? So you're still banking on a front four that can get to the passer of Preston and Za'Darius. You're hoping both those guys can get back to 2019 form or at least close to it. Kenny Clark, Rashawn Gary, a group that still has a lot of potential to get to the quarterback. You have two young linebackers in Kamal Martin and Chris Barnes who you're looking to step up. Now you've got, Stephon Gilmore, Alexander on the outside. Even if it's Sullivan in the slot with two good safeties, you're looking at, Sullivan is the one guy that they can kind of attack. And again, you can put extra emphasis on that. And that's not even mentioning that Green Bay could still pick up a guy like maybe an Asante Samuel Jr. in the draft, or, maybe somebody a little bit later that could easily play in the slot. So there are a variety of directions that Green Bay could go still to upgrade that cornerback position and still even get better, which is really scary to think about. And here's one more advantage here, right? So even if Stephon Gilmore, let's say you give up a 3rd round pick and Josh Jackson for Stephon Gilmore. You get him for the 1-year rental. He plays really well, and he signs for another team next year. Green Bay is likely not going to be huge players in free agency next year either because of where they're going to be with the cap, which means he leaves for another team, maybe gets one more big deal, and you might get even like a 4th round pick back in return for a Stephon Gilmore. You might end up trading a 3rd round pick in Josh Jackson for a year of Stephon Gilmore and a future 4th round pick. Like that, even if it's a 5th round pick, right? That in return is still easily worth the 1-year value of a Stephon Gilmore on a only $7 million deal. So there's so many reasons that this makes sense. So why does it not make sense? First of all, he is a 1-year rental. And anytime, and you guys know the Ted Thompson, Brian Gutekunst way of thinking here, giving up a top 100 pick who is a 22, 23-year-old who you're getting on a cheap deal for 4 years, who could end up being a really good football player, is a tough pill to swallow for the rights to pay a 30-plus-year-old player 1 year, $7 million. He could get hurt in training camp and you never see any return on investment for it whatsoever. So there is absolutely some risk there. Next is he just tore his quad in 2020. So he didn't finish the season. It sounds like it wasn't as bad as it sounded. I mean, a torn quad sounds bad, right? But it sounds like everything went well. There was no knee damage or anything like that. And it sounds like he's expected to make a full recovery. But he just didn't finish the season. Had a decline in 2020, certainly in comparison to what he had in 2019. Came off an injury. He's going to be 31 years old in September. Like, there is some downside here that maybe he's not the player that he was. But again, even then, I would argue you don't need him to be all pro Stephon Gilmore. You just need to be really good, and certainly a big upgrade from Kevin King, what King was in 2020. So I still think there's an upside there, but he could easily be on a steady decline. And then the other thing is you could easily get outbid for him, right? So even if Green Bay's willing to bid a 3rd round pick in Josh Jackson, maybe some team is willing to give a 2nd round pick in a player. I don't think they're going to get more than that, but there's a lot of teams that are looking to compete at a high level this year, and adding a Stephon Gilmore for $7 million could be something that another team is very interested in for all the reasons that I just mentioned. And it's not difficult to imagine a scenario where Green Bay actually gets outbid. And I think anything above a 3rd round pick plus a Josh Jackson or a 3rd round pick and maybe like a future 5th, I think is going to be really tough for Green Bay and Brian Gutekunst to swallow for a 1-year rental. So they easily could get outbid. Those are some of the reasons where I think maybe this doesn't happen. So ultimately, what's the verdict here? I would press you to not get super excited and super hopeful about this deal because, as I mentioned, Brian Gutekunst, Ted Thompson, they are not in the business of giving premium draft picks for 1-year rentals who are over 30 coming off an injury, right? And it's usually a good philosophy to have. But my verdict here is I am all in on this move. I think Brian Gutekunst put it best that they're going to have to take some risk this offseason, right? They don't have the ability to go out and sign a player for $15 million. And even if you look on the open market, even if they could, there's not a ton of players that make sense that are young, talented, and fit their positions of need. Cornerback, offensive line, especially on the interior of the offensive line, and maybe like an inside linebacker. There's not a lot of players at those positions that you would want to give premium deals to that are out there anyway. Really, one of the main ones was J.J. Watt, and we know that's not happening. A lot of the other players are older. They're not premium players, and there's just not that player out there. Probably, again, your next best option, in my opinion, is Corey Linsley. So that perfect option doesn't exist. And again, even if it did, you probably don't have the money to go out and get them. And if you do, you're probably mortgaging a huge chunk of the future. So you are getting an opportunity here at $7 million to not mortgage your future. You're only giving up, let's say, a third round pick here, which you can make up by making some other trades plus some of the comp picks in the future. And you're getting a player that if he returns to form, even for just one season, you're getting arguably one of the top 5 corners, maybe the top corner if he returns to form in the NFL, to pair with Jair Alexander and make one of the most dominant defensive backfields in all of football and maybe one of the best cornerback tandems that we've seen in some time. Is there risk to it? Absolutely. But this is absolutely the type of risk that Green Bay needs to take this offseason and see if it pays off and see if they can get back to a Super Bowl and ultimately win it. I am all in on this. I wouldn't get your hopes up. I can't stress enough. I would not get your hopes up, but I think this makes a ton of sense for Green Bay. And this is the type of smart, calculated risk that Green Bay should be taking in 2021 with the salary cap situation the way that it is. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, subscribe. If you didn't subscribe, thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate you as always. Make sure to check out tomorrow's edition where I'll be right back here tomorrow on YouTube. Make sure to check out Andrew Engage on an all new episode of the Pack a Day podcast, wherever you get the audio version. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.